Hello, and welcome to another episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and I'd like to talk today about Russia's army because this is very much in the news now with the Ukraine. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but it is surprising. All of the experts said, the Russian steamroller. I mean, what's Ukraine? Actually, Ukraine gave up all its nuclear weapons too, so it's like, well, they're going to roll through, and that's the way it goes. But it didn't. So it got me thinking, well, now, what is the record of the Russian army, the Red Army, as it used to be, the Soviet army, from before the time of the communists right up to present times? And I noticed it's like, of course, everybody invades Russia. I mean, even the Swedes were invading Russia and doing fairly good, and we know that. And then, of course, Napoleon invaded Russia, and as the Russians said, truly enough, he was defeated by General Winter. But the French got all the way to Moscow, which is something the Germans didn't even do, and something happened. The city burned down, and they had to stagger back. So that, in a sense, you could say maybe the problem is that the Russians rely too much on General Winter. I don't know, but it was uh, World War One. The Red Army mobilizes, and another problem with the Russian army is there's always a mass of conscripts, and usually they get them drunk, and then they just load in wagons and ship. The whole treatment of them, I think, is very bad. And this is traditional in Russia. They get the conscripts drunk and drag them off, and then of course rigid discipline. So in the beginning of World War One, for a few weeks, the army lunged across the border of East Prussia into Germany, but the Germans got up General Ludendorff and um, I can't think of the other guy. Uh, but anyway, and they defeated the Battle of Tannenberg. And what the German commanders did was they realized the Russians were invading with two columns, and so as any smart general would do, you go between the columns and cut off, hit if they're overwhelming, which of course they always were in numbers, defeat the one and then the other. And the one army, Russian army, was defeated. Hindenburg, I think the guy was named after the dirigible, and he and Ludendorff tackled the Russians separately. And apparently, even the German intelligence had figured out that the two Red Army generals hated each other. And so when General Samsonov was attacked, General Reninoff did not come to his aid. And so, first of all, or they have it backwards, Rennenkopf, Samsonov. But anyway, the one of them was defeated badly, and the other guy wouldn't come. So, well, what's your problem? Well, I'll help you in a minute. And so the other guy was completely defeated, went and committed suicide in the forest. So the Russian army was pushed way back. And throughout, there were certain victories at the Russian army, but not very many. And the Germany just kept pushing back. And Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarians were fighting them as well and doing a fairly good job for the great shambling empire of Austria-Hungary, prison cage of races it was called at the time. And eventually, several things happened, which, first of all, the abdication of the Czar, because the war was going so badly, and the supplies in the city, bread riots and so on, that they finally talked the Czar, Nicholas II, into abdicating, which he did. And then a provisionalist government was set up, one of the two only democratic governments in Russia. They were elected. They had a national election in the midst of all this turmoil. But then that was the government which was overthrown by the communists. And then you had a big civil war between the communists and those who were opposed to communism for whatever reason. Some were like monarchists, others were just like socialists, but not communists. A bloody civil war, which may have killed 1.5, 2 million people. I mean, this is Russia. And so the civil war emerged, the communists emerged as the victors after this terrible civil war and famine as well. And the Russians, in the Volga region, especially where for famine, it was like on an industrial scale, were kept alive by American grain from Herbert Hoover, the cold, indifferent Herbert Hoover of the Depression. He fed the Russians. And do you think we got any thanks from the Russians? No, they're spies, the Americans. But anyway, so finally Russia settled down a bit in the 1920s. Actually, a halfway decent life was emerging because Stalin, who became the dictator, pushed aside Trotsky, who'd been head of the Red Army, as it was called by then. um, allowed, small businesses, a tobacconist, a butcher shop, or whatever, to actually exist and make money. Ooh, but Stalin didn't like that. In 1927, he started to have his uh, 5-year plan. What we're going to do really is industrialize Russia on the backs of the peasants. We'll take all their grain really at our prices, and as what happened here, of course, which I should have a special talk on, should have it on the Holodomor, that is the Ukrainian famine, in which maybe 10 million people died. And you say, oh, well, that's an exaggeration. Well, listen, uh, Churchill was talking to Stalin during World War II, and he said, "What's all this? How many do you think really died in this famine?" Stalin holds up his hands like this. If Stalin says 10 million, I mean, you got to take his word for it. Well, anyway, then the official foreign policy of the Soviet Union at this time was, let's get all people who hate, after the coming of Hitler, all freedom-loving people to fight the fascists, the Nazis. And so even if you're on the right, I mean, apparently bishops on the same platform as communists yelling down with Hitler and unite for freedom, which they did in the Spanish Civil War, which is a real heartbreaker because supposedly the bad guys, the fascists, won under Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And to pay for a lot of Russian aid, Spain gave all its treasure, which was a lot because the wealth, the gold of the New World, they gave it to Russia to pay for it. Deduct they never got it back again. Okay. Anyway, but then to the stupefaction of communists and pro-communists and people who were fighting for the right side, such as in Spain, Hitler and Stalin signed this 1939 pact. Now it was like we're buddies now, and all this, and the war began in September of 1939. The Hitler-Stalin Pact was August of 1939, and what happened? By the time it gets argued that this, and I've used this argument to communist historians, that Russian fueled or aviation spirit fueled German bombers that were blasting British cities. Okay, because Russia supplied oil to Germany, Nazi Germany, and then the Germans supplied machine goods. The Germans are very good at that, and a cruiser even they supplied to the Soviets. So both sides got along pretty well. We said, well, two of a kind. What do you expect? And they're working together like this. And eventually, though, the word gets into Stalin. Look, Hitler's planning to invade you. I mean, you're the real enemy. Hitler's always down with communism, Judeo-Bolshevism, that sort of thing. And Stalin just you're a provocateur. And a number of spies were actually shot when they came back and said, look, we got all this information about the Germans are really preparing to invade Russia. In fact, there was one German communist, he'd been drafted into the German army right along the River Bug, which is where the German forces in Poland were lined up. As you know, Germany and Russia invaded Poland at the same time. People don't talk much about the Russian invasion of Poland, but as according to the Hitler-Stalin Pact, that's how a secret treaty divided up Poland. I mean, nobody has the Poles, just cut the country in half. Russians get the east, Germans get the west. This guy swam across the Bug River and said, I'm there. We're there right now, getting ready for tomorrow morning to attack. And Stalin said, that's a provocation. Have the guy shot. Now, I don't know if events overcame him getting shot. I don't know whatever happened to the poor joker. But at any rate, on June 22nd, 1941, to Stalin's utter amazement, I mean, can you imagine Hitler invading me? I mean, this Hitler, the German forces rolled across the border in Operation Barbarossa. And this really shows the Russian army how it's so much dependent from the top down, because the German, all of the battle orders came from Stalin himself, and his scientific brilliance was stand, fight ferociously, never give an inch away. So the Germans just they have what they call a Kassel, like a cap or a pot, I think, which they surrounded the Russians. And at the Battle of Kiev, which the pronunciation was called Kiev then, now it's Kiev, which of course was part of Russia then. Something like 600,000 Russian soldiers were captured. It's supposed to be the biggest capturing in modern history. And all because the Russian commanders there, Pavlov and so were telegraphing or radioing Stalin back in Moscow. We're being surrounded. We got to pull back. And he said, you stand or you'll be shot. As a matter of fact, I believe Pavlov was shot. Okay, another one, Kirponis, another general was shot. Well, and there's a reason, not a reason, there's a number of reasons. One of them is that Stalin had some pretty good generals before the war, such as Tukhachevsky, General Kork, General Ulbrich, and they were all shot. Oh, what did they do? Well, they didn't do anything really. Tukhachevsky was a real leader in combined warfare, land, air, working together, radio near tanks and that sort of thing. And Stalin he had the purge in the 30s was insane. Something like of the top 5 marshals of this Red Army, 3 were shot and 1 was put out to pasture or something. And one of those shot was Tukhachevsky. And they certainly could have used Tukhachevsky then. So the German army, the Nazis rolled on, taking one city after a lot of the cities we know now, from like Kiev and Mariupol and so on. They were taken. And to be fair, now the Red Army fought hard. Okay, well you're going to get shot if you don't. But even the Germans remarked on the bravery of the Russian soldiers, and bravery, like they'd link arms and shout hurrah or hurrah for Stalin and charge the Germans, who would mow them down. And this went on. One city after another being captured. Orel, and in fact, they got Orel. The trolley cars were still running in Orel, and under new management. And so they got actually to the gates of Moscow. And it's not an exaggeration, because apparently with high-powered field glasses, the forward reconnaissance forces of the Nazi army actually could see the spires of the Kremlin. Okay, but then something happened. A remarkable coincidence, or whatever you want to call it. One spy that Stalin did listen to was a guy called, I can't think of his name. He was a Russian spy, Sorge, S-O-R-G-E. It doesn't have a Russian, but he was a Russian spy in Japan. Japan was neutral at this time. And he gets a lot of Japanese drunk. I mean, I guess, Russians drink Japanese under the table. And he heard from, he was kind of drinking buddies with some pretty high up Japanese officers, and they're saying, "Oh, we're going to take over the southern route. We're not going to fight Russia. We're going to fight America, Britain, France. Get those colonies back, because what we need is oil, tin, rubber, and you don't have that up in Siberia." See, they had been fighting up in where Siberia and Mongolia meet. And here's one case: the Russian army did very well under General Zhukov. So I thought all the generals were shot. Well, Zhukov was out there fighting the Japanese and doing very well. So Stalin said, "Well, we'll let this guy go." And so, but you see, Stalin's wondering, well, now the Germans are invading from the west. Aren't the Japanese going to attack from the east? And Sorge said, "No, my best information is that the Japanese are going to go southward." And they did, Pearl Harbor. And well, of course, Stalin couldn't shoot Sorge in Tokyo, so he got away with getting definite information. And so Stalin acted on that and brought most of his troops to the west from Mongolia. And these were battle-hard. Many were Siberians. Now, the temperature of the Germans, it's 30 below zero. No, it's terrible. To the Siberians, 30 below zero, kind of normal weather. We've seen worse. And they all had fur coats and everything, whereas the Germans were just, the Germans felt the war is going to be over. We'll be in Moscow, by September or something like that. We don't need warm weather clothing. But the Siberians certainly had it, because they were in Siberia all this time. So they came, and Stalin hurled them, these hardy Siberian, not other Russian soldiers, of course, hurled them at the German forces on December 7th, 1941, and sent them back about 100 miles. It's the first serious defeat that the Germans had suffered in World War II, and you got to give the Red Army credit for that. Well, you might say December 7th, 1941. Well, that's the day the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor, right? You're right. The same thing happened. The same incredible coincidence. And then a few days after that, Hitler, brilliant strategist, Hitler declares war on the United States. He's already fighting Russia, the British Empire, and now the Americans. I mean, might as well finish them all off. And so the Germans were pushed back about 100 miles. But the Germans are very good in defense. They rallied, dug in, and fought back and stopped the Russians. In fact, the Russians Stalin said, "Come on, keep on going." And they were extending their supply lines and all number. The commander said, "No, we better hold in, dig in here just for a while." And the Russians were overwhelmed in this counterattack after the big battle of Moscow. As a matter of fact, one of the Russian generals was actually said, "I've had it with Stalin. That's it." And he went over to the Russia to the Germans, and tried to form some sort of a anti-Russian Russian legion, but he didn't have very much success because the problem with the Nazis, they a lot of, especially Ukrainians, welcomed the Nazis because if they're anti-Stalin, anti-communist, they must be doing something right. And but what happened? And the Nazis said, "Oh, go back to collective farms. You better get that grain, or we'll shoot you." And so they said, oh, "Well, at least the enemy we know." And so they a great opportunity, if you want to look at it that way, for the Nazis was when they blew it, especially in the Ukraine and the other countries around Russia, like the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which Stalin had just taken. Um, these people at first did welcome the Germans very much so, and even carried out anti-Semitic exercises. But nonetheless, almost all of them were alienated by the brutal German policy that if they're Easterners, they're Untermenschen, subhuman, and and are to be enslaved. Now, the attitude towards the Russians wasn't so much as towards the Jews, kill them all. No, put them to work. And as a matter of fact, there were about 1 million Russians who donned German uniforms, either as worker troops or as just actually even troops on the so-called Vlasov army. Vlasov was the Russian general who defected to the Germans. It's an awful story because after the war, he surrendered to the Americans, or I guess it was the British. They turned him over to the Russians. And it took 2 years before they announced that Vlasov had been executed. I can't even imagine what Stalin did to Vlasov before he finally put him out of his misery. Well, there was one more big knockdown, drag-out battle, which we didn't know at the time what the result would be, and that was the Battle of Kursk. It's the greatest tank battle in the war. It's no wonder Stalin said this is the first front. You Westerners, like going to land in France and all, that's the second front, North Africa, France. So that's, and you look at the numbers. I mean, it's like almost 10-1, the numbers of people engaged on the Eastern Front and the numbers engaged on the Western Front. Well, Kursk, both sides hurled their equipment at each other. And finally, the Russians prevailed. Probably one reason why, because we had the Enigma secret. We had this, the British had cracked the German code. Well, thanks to the Poles. The Poles first cracked it, passed it on to the British. And they could tell Stalin that here at Kursk, which I think is in the Ukraine today, there's going to be this big, the Germans are really going to attack you here. So Stalin did maneuver, but enormous, like 10, 20,000 dead and that sort of thing, even a battle in which he won. And then, of course, actually, I'm skipping ahead here. Stalingrad would be in late 1942. Well, actually, they got to Stalingrad in September, and the very name meant that Stalin would never give it up, and Hitler would never stop trying to get it. And they were just bogged down there. And then General von Paulus, the German commander, said, "We got to get out of here." And Hitler said, "You stand your ground." And, as I say, there's not a lot different between Hitler and Stalin in so many ways. And so what happened was that the Russians surrounded Germans just the way the Germans used to surround the Russians, and they gradually starved them out. And out of about 200,000 members of the German Sixth Army, about under 100,000 survived to horrible treatment. I mean, you imagine what it's like to be in a Russian POW camp. Not to mention the fact that the Russians hated the Germans because they were invading Russia. Okay, because we didn't do anything to you guys. We were fulfilling our part of the deal. So the Stalingrad was a tremendous defeat for Germany. And Goebbels tried to play it up like they're falling here, just like Thermopylae. And they use the analogy of Thermopylae. They were overwhelmed by these barbarians, but they lie in glory, and not victory, but glory. Well, and then after that came the Battle of Kursk, which really, but after that, all the battles, the Germans fought but it wasn't like who's going to win this one. From then on, it was on the road to Berlin. And what happened, a lot of the incompetent suck-in generals who took the place of the generals Stalin had shot before the war began to know what they were doing, and through experience and so on. And even Stalin would appoint a guy, or approve an appointment of a guy who seemed to have to know what he was doing, and not just loving comrade Stalin. And so, but still, the Russians used the human wave technique right out to the end. Apparently, they lost 30,000 dead taking Berlin. I mean, by this time, now the Germans are excellent, maybe the best defense fighters ever, but still the enormous casualties that the Russians fought in rolling up the way to the road to Berlin. We pulled back, even though in some places we were closer to Berlin. We said, look, the Russians have suffered. Let them have the glory of taking Berlin. As a matter of fact, I may have said before in the previous broadcast, 25 million Russians died in World War II. Our deaths were 400,000. Germans are 600,000. So, I mean, it's and it's, of course, so many of these deaths were civilian deaths, just killed by the Nazis, not just Jews, but anybody that they opposed them or was seen to oppose them. So anyway, the victory flags were unfurled over Berlin, and then we divide Germany up into four occupation zones: British, American, Russian, and French for some reason. And I was over there then after the war during those occupations. And the only other, the Russians were, Stalin was smart by this time. He says, let's not get involved. So the Korean War, Stalin did not get involved. As a matter of fact, two airplanes, which is maybe excellent pilots, but lousy navigators, actually went into Russia and strafed an airfield. And that declaration where Stalin just said, "Oh, this is terrible. Do something about it." And we paid compensation because we weren't at war with Russia, obviously, and that ended that. Although the Russians certainly supplied North Korea, Mao Zedong and Kim Il Sung with weaponry, and in the Vietnam War, also they were not involved directly. So, of course, by this time, Stalin died in March of 1953. It should be a holiday. I mean, that guy killed more people than I think any other. I mean, more than Hitler. Now, admittedly, Stalin was in office longer, but anyway, going back to where I began, the performance of the Russian army in Ukraine really makes you think, well, now really are they that good? And maybe it's a steamroller that just flattens everybody because they've got the population. And you could argue the population and Winter are the two great generals on the Russian side. Of course, it's not winter now in Ukraine, so maybe it doesn't work so well. But anyway, just thought a little historical background of the Russian army, the Red Army, the Soviet Army, up to the present time. And thank you for listening. This is Dr. Sandler. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.